who know me know that I will talk endlessly, so I'm actually reading my paper just to kind of keep myself confined. So I'm going to be talking about how well-being is collaboratively produced in urban co-housing communities. We are currently in the midst of an obsession with happiness and well-being. Endless academic conferences and publications, policy initiatives, newspaper articles, TED Talks, podcasts, and self-help books focused on the topic testify to the centrality of well-being in our collective imagination. This obsession sits alongside a concern with unhappiness, with declining indicators of well-being that have accompanied the heightened individualism of the second half of the 20th and the first part of the 21st centuries. Evidence of this heightened individualism is ever present. According to the 2016 Canadian census, the number of one-person households in Canada now surpasses all other types of living situations, adding up to almost 30% of households in Canada, more than couples with or without children, single-parent households, or intergenerational households. On the other side of the globe, 18.4 million Japanese live alone, twice the number of 30 years ago. The problems of isolation accompanying these trends are clear. It's all Claudia's fault for messing me up with the microphone. In 2017, a record 45,000 Japanese people died alone, sometimes unnoticed for days or even weeks. And according to the Japanese government's 2010 and 2012 national surveys of lifestyle, loneliness is the key determinant of well-being in Japan, or rather of the lack thereof, not gender, age, income, occupation, or educational level, but loneliness. Finally, according to the OECD, in both Canada and Japan, the percentage of people who report having relatives or friends to count on for support is on the decline. So this obsession with happiness on the one hand and misery on the other might be connected. I would argue that these fixations, and in particular the oppressions of the happiness imperative, by which I mean the obligation to be happy, are diagnostic of the crises of precariousness engendered by neoliberal decollectivization, representing a kind of desperate attempt to be happy in isolation, to de-responsibilize ourselves for the care of others at the very moment that we're being overwhelmed with being responsibilized for our own well-being. It should come as no surprise then that despite our collective concerns with well-being, the ways in which we've worked to address these concerns have for the most part focused on the individual. At the center of all of this sits orthodox happiness studies, dominated by positive psychology and happiness economics. These two disciplines, and I mean that in the Foucauldian sense of connecting disciplinary knowledge with disciplinary institutions, have influenced not only popular culture via a burgeoning happiness industry of techniques of the self, but also a number of governments, including those of France, Britain, Thailand, the UAE, and Singapore, among others, as well as non-governmental agencies such as the United Nations. In orthodox approaches, the individual is the key site of both investigation and intervention. Happiness and well-being are thus located inside individual selves, and policies are accordingly oriented to creating the conditions of possibility for such selves to pursue particular internal states, namely positive psychology's happy couple of satisfaction and positive affect. There's increasing recognition, however, at least in some circles, that such an exclusive focus on the individual is problematic. Social epidemiologists have actually been arguing this for years. As early as the 1960s and 1970s, they were able to document that social and community ties had a greater impact on well-being than socioeconomic status, obesity, smoking, exercise, or alcohol consumption. Similarly, the Harvard study of adult development, which has followed more than 2,000 people over the course of some 80 years, has finally come to the conclusion that community is key. According to its current director and mirroring the Japanese national lifestyle surveys I mentioned a minute ago, loneliness kills. It's as powerful as smoking or alcoholism. Taking a different entry point, scholars writing from the perspective of critical psychology and political economy have explored the linkages between orthodox approaches to happiness and neoliberal forms of governance that devolve responsibility for happiness and well-being, as well as for other social problems like poverty, to the individual. Some have pointed in this regard to a correlation between the type of person most valued in positive psychology and the type of person most valued by neoliberalism. That is, someone who is self-examining, self-governing, active, autonomous, and self-sufficient. Anthropologists, for their part, have argued strongly that happiness and well-being are profoundly culturally and historically specific, in other words, socially defined and produced, a claim shared by cultural psychologists who draw attention to the critical role of culture in explaining psychological functions and behaviors. These emergent critiques have recently prompted even people like Ed Diener, a key figure in positive psychology, to make such groundbreaking statements as, and I quote, "Humans are social animals." Clearly, we need to broaden our scope of attention. Indeed, it takes us years to figure this out. Indeed, given the range of social crises with which we are currently confronted, such as social isolation among the elderly, withdrawal and alienation among youth, which has become such a pattern that the Japanese even have a term for it, hikikomori, and increasing problems with interpersonal violence, suicide, and mental health more generally, there's an urgent need to explore approaches to well-being that don't reproduce the problems generated by extreme forms of individualism. In doing this, we need to highlight what sits outside of dominant Euro-American political and economic frameworks and practices so that we can move beyond opposition to the shortcomings of mainstream approaches to imagine and practice other ways of doing things. So what I want to do with the rest of my time is describe one other way of doing things, namely that represented by urban collective housing communities, in order to play with the idea that while the experience of well-being may be subjective, this doesn't necessarily mean that its production is individual or that it is an exclusive characteristic or property of the self. I focus on two communities, Quayside Village in Vancouver and Kankanmori in Tokyo. Significantly, Kankanmori and Quayside Village locate well-being as much in sets of social relations as in individual minds, hearts, or bodies. Attending to how these communities operate and to the lives of those who live in them can help us expand our approaches to happiness, to how we define it, how we think about how and where it is generated and by what means, and how we might engage with it in our daily practices, ranging from envisioning the good life to participating in social and political activities designed to enhance well-being or at least reduce unhappiness. Kankanmori and Quayside Village are what's known as intentional communities, which the Fellowship for Intentional Community defines as, quote, a group of people who live together or share common facilities and who regularly associate with each other on the basis of explicit common values. What's interesting about Kankanmori and Quayside Village relative to some other kinds of intentional communities like spiritual communities or eco-villages is that they're integrated with rather than segregated from society at large, that they're deliberately cross-generational, and that they make space for the private or individual as well as the public and collective. As such, they represent forms of utopic practice that articulate claims about what is wrong with society and desires for something better while remaining fundamentally engaged with the society around them, in the process transcending with, against, inside, outside, and individual collective binaries. Quayside Village and Kankanmori are the first purpose-built urban collective housing communities in their cities. Kankanmori, which occupies 2 floors of a 12-story building, has 36 people living in 28 units, while Quayside Village has 29 people in 19 units. By purpose-built, I mean that in both cases, a group of people got together with the idea of building a community. Oriented to addressing social isolation and alienation by creating forms of social organization that balance interdependence and independence, they worked with architects to construct a built environment that would increase possibilities for interaction while simultaneously allowing residents to maintain privacy when they so desired. So both of these, you can see from both of these that individual apartments, and each apartment has its own kitchen and bathroom, so they're completely, self-contained, are organized in a kind of horseshoe shape around common spaces. And the same is the case at Kankanmori. So here's the individual rooms, and common spaces are, everybody's oriented inwards towards the community. Common spaces in both communities consist of common kitchen and dining areas, vegetable and flower gardens, laundry rooms, and play areas for children. So this is the common kitchen at Quayside Village. So in addition to everybody's individual kitchens, there's this really large kitchen for cooking huge meals and common meals for everybody. Here is the courtyard at Quayside Village, the inside courtyard. So the individual apartments are located, are kind of circle around the courtyard and look into the courtyard. This is the kitchen at Kankanmori, and here is the dining area at Kankanmori. And it's hard to see in this photo, but the way they built it is that the ceiling of the common kitchen, of the common dining area, goes up to the second floor, and on the second floor there are windows looking down into the common room. So when people come out of their second floor apartments, they're oriented into the common space. Recognizing that space is only one aspect of community building, both Quayside Village and Kankanmori are also self-governing, devising and revising as necessary their own sets of values and organizational structures. Both communities are also oriented to economic and environmental concerns, which they address by pooling resources, such as, for instance, sharing laundry facilities or large kitchen equipment, by growing some of their own food, and composting and recycling. Finally, both communities are, in a sense, demonstration projects. Each hosts a number of events to which residents from the surrounding neighborhoods are invited. They're therefore involved in utopic practices that are inclusive rather than isolationist, and that envision the good life not as already formed, but rather as emergent, contingent, and interactive with society at large. So they're not separating themselves off into this ideal world, but they're kind of going down a path, a utopic path, heading in the right direction, and inviting everybody around them to participate in that. Although predominantly middle class and able-bodied, the people who live in Kankanmori and Quayside Village are diverse in terms of where they come from, their professional backgrounds, their ages, sexualities, and household compositions. This diversity is deliberate. However, they all share a desire to live with others in a mutually dependent environment that nevertheless allows them to maintain their own separate lives. So let me give you just a little sense of the kind of people who move into these communities and why they have moved in. Otsuki-san, a Kankanmori resident, moved in after the death of her husband. Up until his death, she said, I had been able to exchange energy with him pretty well. But then I had no one else to do that with, and I wasn't connected to the community. I was on my own. I had more energy than I knew what to do with. And then I saw this place on TV. I was intrigued. It looked like a place where I could have that mutual exchange of energy. Another resident, Yutaka-san, and this is Yutaka-san here, who is one of the oldest residents at Kankanmori, feeding Toma-kun, who is one of the youngest. Yutaka-san lived with his mother, who did everything, meals, laundry, cleaning, everything, until she died at the age of 89. His brother decided that Yutaka-san couldn't live alone, and so suggested that he move into Kankanmori. Now 80, he's been living at Kankanmori for over 10 years, and he's very happy to be there. There's always someone around to share afternoon tea with, or drinks in the evening, or common meals, or excursions to restaurants, or a karaoke. And he actually sneaks his own alcohol into karaoke bars so he doesn't have to pay for it. It's a little society here, he says. Others moved in because they felt lonely and alienated in their high-rise Tokyo apartments, or because they wanted their children to grow up in a safe environment where they would be exposed to a diversity of people and ways of doing things. Ora-san, a long-term resident, summed it up like this. We live under the same roof, and we greet each other, have conversations, have a meal and tea together, sometimes drink together, actually often drink together, go out together sometimes, care for one another's children, watch the children growing, care for the sick together, share happiness together, and of course work together to solve any conflict. Sometimes I receive insight from older people, and I receive energy from younger people. The patterns at Quayside Village were similar. People moved in because they wanted to maintain independence while avoiding isolation. They wanted to provide a rich, safe environment for their children, and they wanted to be environmental stewards via the sharing of resources, thereby reducing the damage done by everyone having their own house, their own washing machine, so on and so forth. Phil, who moved in to Quayside Village in order to be with his now wife, indexed the issue of isolation in particular when he told me, quote, I can't imagine going back to a life with neighbors I don't know, neighbors that don't want to know me, neighbors that I look at the ground when I walk past because I don't want an awkward conversation, neighbors that aren't looking out for me, end quote. Another resident said that moving into Quayside Village literally saved her life. She would never have survived living alone. Orasan's comments that I read to you just a second ago make clear that people also moved into these communities for the rich social life. As Kankanmori resident Sugana-san once told me, it's more fun to live with more people. It's worth noting that a number of resident stories indexed a relationship between moving into a collective community and reevaluations of life as a whole that entailed critiques of the happiness imperative. Some Kankanmori residents even changed jobs and reassessed friendships, while others altered the relative weighting of various activities in their life. So Sugano-san, who I just mentioned, it's more fun to live with more people, used to just be 100% focused on his job, and then decided that now it's interesting to think about, curtains and interior decorating and meal preparation, so on and so forth. So he has a more expansive, richer life. These reconfigurations reflected, in their view, ongoing efforts to create a mutually beneficial harmonization of the person and the community, neither of which would cannibalize the other. This was not then about a rejection of the individual, but nor is participating in community only about boosting one's personal level of happiness, getting at the self via the detour of the other. Rather, people told me, it's about building a healthy community with a capital C. That is, the community, as one person put it, that is a basic characteristic of humanity. And this community with a capital C was less about recreating idealized traditional household forms than about grafting ideas about past ways of living that were less isolating with contemporary realities and aspirations. As one Kankanmori resident put it, we are neither friends nor family, but something different, something new. As much as they share, Quayside Village and Kankanmori have markedly different organizational philosophies and structures. The way in which Quaysiders approach completing tasks and taking on the responsibilities necessary for a functioning and thriving community may be summed up as each according to their strengths, each according to their desires. Invitation is stressed over obligation, so participation in any of Quayside Village's 6 committees or in its weekly common meals is completely voluntary. Kankanmori's philosophy, in contrast, may be summed up as everybody is equal. Fairness here is about sameness, about each member contributing in equal measure. Thus, each adult member has to serve on 2 of Kankanmori's 22 committees, contribute to the preparation of a common meal once a month, and participate in monthly cleaning and the watering of collective vegetable gardens in the summer. These differences reflect differences in cultural contexts and speak to one of the goals of my research, to compare urban collective housing communities in 2 very different societies, one traditionally and ideologically oriented to the collective, the other to the individual, in order to underscore variations. So neither Kankanmori nor Quayside Village is representative in any kind of recipe book-like fashion. Rather, each is illustrative of a model that can take any number of forms depending on context and desire. In conclusion, the need to rethink privatized versus shared space has been gaining increasing traction among city planners, urban studies scholars, architects, activists, and regular people just looking for something better. Given that most of the world's population now lives in cities, with the proportion rising each decade, if we're looking for an alternative to the hyper-individualized models of life common in contemporary urban contexts, then co-housing communities offer a viable model of social sustainability and, in the process of living together and sharing resources, of environmental sustainability as well. Both Kankanmori and Quayside Village, which emphasize living together, represent alternatives that are emerging within the mainstream. They move beyond criticism and complaint to offer a potential direction in which we might want to go. In positing the individual and the collective as inextricably tied and mutually constitutive, they provide an opportunity to explore the spaces in between, offering a release from the either-or binaries that plague us. At the very least, Kankanmori and Quayside Village and places like them can serve to broaden the terrain of discussion, something desperately needed given the speed with which the happiness imperative has gained currency in a range of popular and policy-making contexts. At the same time as I'm presenting urban collective housing communities as refusals of and alternatives to the radical individualism and consumerism of the happiness imperative, however, I'm acutely aware of the need to avoid romanticizing them and of the importance of positioning them as regimes of propriety in their own right. Community, in other words, can entail exclusion and imposition, So we need to recognize places like Quayside Village and Kankanmori as collaborative nexuses of utopic desire, culture, and governance. But this doesn't diminish the importance of the ways in which they highlight the problems of isolation, alienation, and environmental degradation produced by individualized forms of consumerism, or the instruction that they provide in the importance and the pleasures of connection. And since I probably have 30 seconds left, I have just a couple more slides. So this is the gardening at Quayside Village. So they're growing vegetables for the community to eat. Here's the community garden at Kankanmori. Here is the annual mochi making at Kankanmori. So they make their own mochi and they make their own miso. So there's a lot of social activity that happens. This is making a common meal in Kankanmori's kitchen. Here is a common meal at Kankanmori. Here is a common meal at Quayside Village. And in the summer, common meals at Quayside Village are held outside in the courtyard. Here is supposed to be the cherry blossom season picnic at Kankanmori, but the weather didn't cooperate. They have after parties after the common meal. They have after parties where people will sit around for hours drinking and singing and so on and so forth. So here's an after party at Kankanmori. People just hanging out. You can see the cross-generational aspect there. And this is a photo at Quayside Village. I brought some of the people from Kankanmori over to visit Quayside Village. So you can get a sense of the richness of social life in these communities. That's it. Thank you very much.